Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Asheville Museum of Science Ask a Scientist series. This week's talk features Elizabeth Erickson, who is a sixth-year PhD student, God bless her, in the Department of Earth Science at University of California, Santa Barbara. So Elizabeth is going to talk with us about a number of really cool Earth science topics, including some of the history of the supercontinent Gondwana, how rocks have been deposited over geologic time, and just her overall experience as a geologist and as an expert. So get cozy and go ahead and send in your questions for Elizabeth along the way, and we will learn what petrochronology and crustal evolution means together. So Elizabeth, I will pass it off to you.
Great. I'll just share my screen then. All right. So I started my first title based on the research that I do at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And so this first title is called Petrochronologic Insight into Episodic Crustal Recycling along the paleo-Pacific margin of Gondwana. And that might be a lot of words that a lot of you don't know that much about. So I actually decided to create a second title, which sort of breaks it down a little bit more. Let me figure out, there it goes. And so that all of those fancy words basically break down to what can rocks from Antarctica tell us about Earth's continents through time and how they've changed. And so Antarctica was once a part of this supercontinent called Gondwana, which was made up of a lot of continents that we have today. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as I go along, but those rocks are really special and they have the ability to tell us about something about our global continent history. So I have this little outline slide. I told Abby that I plugged in, so feel free to ask questions and I'll try to make a natural pause at each of these to answer whatever you guys want to know about. So I'm a petrochronologist, but really that's made up of a bunch of different types of fields. And so the first one I'm going to talk about is geochronology. Geo is based on geology or earth. And then chronology basically is just the study of time. And so geochronology is the study of Earth's time, or dating all the Earth materials like rocks, fossils, and sediments. And there's a variety of ways that geologists record time. And we'll get into that, but what I love about geochronology and geology broadly is that you can go to somewhere like the Grand Canyon in Arizona, which might just be a beautiful scenery to you. But when I look at the Grand Canyon, I see 1.8 billion years of geologic activity, from fossils to volcanic activities to rock deposition or rock collection. So for me, this is what makes geology so exciting and why I really like geochronology, because I get to unravel this history of our Earth through the science that I do. And when we talk about time in Earth, we really broadly divide it into something called the geologic time scale, which is very complicated looking at first and very colorful. And I won't make you look, I won't read this to you, but it's a really important system for geologists and paleontologists and biologists and all sorts of different sciences, because this is basically how scientists first started breaking up time in Earth's history. It's easy to know human history because we can look at records, but once we go back past humans, there's not a lot of evidence for us to know what was going on. And so we've broadly used this geologic time scale to understand not just rocks, but also life going back through Earth's history. And so for geology and specifically, what I do is I try to date rocks, and there's two broad categories when you try to date something. There's relative dating, which is just like the relative age of something. So an example would be a child is relatively younger than their grandparent, but then there's also absolute dating, which is the exact age of a rock. And that would be like saying the child is 10 years old and the grandparent is 60 years old. They're very specific dates that tell you that same relative relationship, but with absolute numbers. And within both of those types of rock dating fields, there's honestly so many types of geology studies that you could go into to understand dating. And I fall into the type of rock dater that uses absolute dating because I want to know exact dates of rocks. And in particular, I use something called radioactivity, which basically just means if you could take an unstable atom, the nucleus of it, which is this inside center of that atom, that's what's unstable, and it releases some energy. And when that energy shoots out, that atom then breaks apart and turns into this secondary atom that we call like the product atom. And that secondary atom might be the end product where it stops, or sometimes it's also unstable and it continues to break down into more and more atoms. And there's a variety of ways that these atoms can break down. We broadly say that there's about 3 types of decay that these atoms can take, but we won't go into those details too much. I just want you to get an idea of when I'm talking about the dating for my rocks that I study. I use this radioactive decay system because I want to use we'll talk about it. I'll get into it in the next slide. So if we start with some amount of that starting initial unstable atom, through time as it decays, it's going to turn into that secondary atom. So if we could think about this as a relative proportion, if we started with 100% of that starting unstable atom, through time, we call this half-lives. It's just the amount of time it takes half of that initial atom to decay into that secondary atom. That gives us that time aspect. And so we can see this chart here. It doesn't really matter which type of atom we use, they all decay in the same way. Through time, half of them will decay into that secondary atom until what was the starting atom eventually runs out, and all we have left is that secondary atom. And this is important because we can look at the amount of starting atom and the amount of secondary atom, and that gives us time. And across Earth's history, using methods like mine has been able to tell us really fascinating things about really old history on Earth. Most people are probably familiar with carbon dating or maybe using tree rings. Those are very common ways to date things, but they're relatively young dating methods, which overlap a lot with human history. But when I look at my atoms that decay, this allows us to go even further back in time for several billions of years. And so through geochronology with radioactive decay, that's how we've been, as scientists, have been able to understand how Earth first formed, when Earth divided into different layers, when the core formed. It's how we think we know how the moon formed from a giant bombardment. It's how we know when the first crust must have formed with these things called Jack Hill zircon, which I want to highlight because I also study zircon in my rocks from Antarctica. And so zircon are a really important tool to help me do geochronology. And then there's just more and more, and I won't go into too many details of this, of the other things that we've learned through geochronology, but we know a lot about Earth's history based on how these unstable atoms decay into these secondary atoms. And then I don't know if Abby has any questions already.
Yeah, so I have a few. So one of them being, how does like an atom become unstable in the first place to create or to cause that decay?
Great question. So I didn't put this diagram in because I was trying not to to introduce too many types of science to all of you, but basically, if you, when we think about atoms, we usually use a schematic where there's this inner nucleus, which is really, really tiny, and then it's surrounded by what we call shells of different electrons. And what happens is that those electron shells can only hold so many types of particles, and sometimes the particle number is wrong, and it causes those particles to want to shift in across the different shells. And if they shift out of their shell, that's when they sort of get shot off the atom itself, and that's that energy that is released, which is what allows that whole atom to restructure and decay into that secondary atom. Great.
And then we have another question that says, what elements are zircons made of?
Oh, great. Zircons are actually basically like a cubic zirconium. If any of you have heard of that, it's a pretty popular jewelry material. It's basically element zirconium. Sorry, my brain was just thinking of the word zircon for a second. It's the element zirconium, and then almost all minerals are made up of some structure of silicon and oxygen. And so zircon is basically just zirconium, silica, and oxygen. But sometimes that zirconium atom is replaced by impurities, which we'll talk a little bit about, but the decay that I look at is using uranium and lead. So both of those try to squeeze into just uranium tries to squeeze in and replace the zirconium, and then that uranium decays into lead, and that's what we can see in the zircon mineral.
And do you have a favorite era?
Oh, great question. I actually really like the Hadean, which I didn't give you all a perfect view of what that geologic time scale is, but I like the Hadean because the word Hadean means no rock. It's supposed to be before Earth had anything. It was probably just a big molten ball of magma at the time. And what I love about that is if you like spread your arms out end to end, human history is like a file shred of your fingernails, but the Hadean is like the other hand all the way to like my face, and the idea that is how long Earth went with almost no rocks is kind of mind-boggling to me. So I think that's my favorite period.
So has Earth not always been a terrestrial planet that you can walk on?
It has not, and I can't remember now. I have a clip later on that I'm going to show that I think starts at Earth formation, but Earth actually formed with the Big Bang when our solar system was forming. It was just shooting a bunch of space debris all over the place, and when more solid debris collides with other space debris, basically, they create some heat, and then that heat sort of attracts other space debris to sort of glom on, and eventually those create something called a planetesimal. And if you imagine that they're like shooting out as they sort of ping and hit each other, they start getting that circle rotation, and as more and more material gathers, the density of it creates basically that gravity field that holds the whole rest of the planet together. And so when Earth first formed in that process, it would have just been a hot molten ball until slowly all of that material cooled through time. And then for Earth in particular, what we think is that when our sun formed, it only had the elements, I won't go into these details, I guess, but it only had so many elements to contribute to the formation of Earth, and that meteors from further out in space that come through our solar system and collided with Earth is what brought the elements that allowed us to have water, our atmosphere. And when Earth first formed, that when I showed that diagram and said the core formed in that first maybe I think 50 million years of Earth history, that's really important because that's what allows us to have a magnetic field and what allows our atmosphere to stay tucked against our planet so that we can breathe when we go outside, and so that it's a livable condition when we go outside. Otherwise, it would actually be really, really cold.
Yeah, and so we have one more before we move on, and this one is again kind of that existential question and into astronomy a little bit, but do we think the moons of the planets were formed in the same manner as ours?
Oh, that's a great question. So most of the planets in our solar system, we think formed similar to how Earth did. And there's this thing called a zone of habitability around the sun. And it has something to do with the sun's gravity pulling things towards it, and those objects trying to fly away from the sun. And because light things like gases are really uh, resistant, I guess, to gravity, you could say, they're able to fly off some planets, and other planets have so much density, like Jupiter, that they can be really they have a lot of gases, and the gravity keeps it pulled against the planet. And so all of the planets formed about the same time, we think, but the makeup of them is very different based on how far from the sun they are, and then how big the planet itself is, and whether that gravity holds certain elements to it. Our moon, however, we think formed after Earth, when a giant different planetesimal type object sort of smashed into Earth and sort of shot this little piece of molten material off, which got stuck rotating around Earth because of Earth's gravity. Cool. All right, so we started with geochronology, and but I said that I'm a petrochronologist, so we still need to talk about that extra little adjective on that name, and this comes from petrology, which is the study of rocks and the conditions under which they form. And there are all types of petrologists, but I specifically am something called an igneous petrologist, because I study rocks that form from magma. So on this left, you can see this sort of volcanic display, and based on where a rock forms in a volcanic system, we have lots of different names for it. But what's really fascinating about igneous petrology is that essentially these are all the same materials. If on the right, this is something called a thin section, which is if we could take one of those rocks and cut a super thin layer out of it and then look under it through a light, you would be able to see the individual crystals that make up that rock. Broadly, those rocks, wherever they form in that volcanic system, have the same makeup. The difference in igneous petrology is that as that magma cools, the crystals can either be really big or really small. And then sometimes that magma can do other things like flow, which then allows certain crystals to build up. And so when we think about what I do, which is petrochronology, I'm basically using these rocks from volcanic systems and then taking their chemistry to unravel when they formed, that time component, but also how they formed. So where in a volcanic system, and when in a volcanic system that they formed. And so I know I threw in some extra terms there, but the big one being what I always think is magma, which I think most people know the word lava, and really lava and magma are the exact same thing. I love this little cartoon because a lot of people get in debates about if something's lava or is it magma, and really it doesn't matter. It's just that lava represents molten material at the surface of Earth, and magma represents molten material inside of Earth. And the only reason we differentiate that is that when we think about magma in this bottom diagram, it's under the planet. And so it allows that material to cool slow enough that those crystals can become big enough that when I take that rock, I can see crystals inside it. And that those crystals are important because if we go back to our decay system, I can take one of those crystals, and I already told you I use zircon. And if we know it starts with a certain amount of uranium, through time, each of these red dots represents more and more of the secondary atom. In this case, it's lead. We can start dating those rocks. And so I use the uranium to lead decay system. And this is really fascinating, which again, I won't go into too many details, but uranium is a really neat element because I keep saying these are radioactive atoms, but really we call these isotopes because different types of atoms, like uranium, can have a slightly different number of um, particles that make them up, the protons, neutrons, and electrons. And so uranium actually has multiple isotopes that decay to several different types of lead isotopes. And that's important because it actually gives me multiple dating systems in the same crystal. And so if we think again back to that time scale with the history of Earth, and I said those Jack Hills zircons, Jack Hills are a location in Australia, which is where we find these zircon that are the oldest material we are able to date on our planet, which is so fascinating. And part of our ability to date them and know that we're correct is that we can do multiple dating systems on the same crystal and compare them and see how accurate our measurements are. And so if we sort of tie this all together with my actual science, you could see that if I start with that magma chamber, and excuse my crude drawing skills on PowerPoint, but if we start with that magma chamber and we have these little zircon crystals forming as that magma cools, through time, it will cool completely and form one of those igneous rocks I was telling you about. I then find that igneous rock and take it to my lab, and I crush it up into tiny little bits of just the crystals that are slowly growing together. And I can take that crystal, like here, this blue crystal is one of those Jack Hill zircons, and I can shoot it with a laser, which then sends it through something called a mass spectrometer, which genuinely takes that blasted off material and shoots it through something called a plasma torch, which here in my little diagram, you can see all these pluses and negatives. These are all the little atoms that are being shot off that zircon, and that material being shot off is then sent through this giant magma, this mass spectrometer, which has a lot of parts, but all that really matters is that that giant magma allows us to pinpoint the exact isotopes of uranium and lead that we want to measure so that we can compare the ratios of them. And when I do this with my data, I get something like this bottom little chart, which is nonsense to most people, but basically it's giving me all of those different isotopes of different things that make up that zircon. And that raw data is what I then convert into ages. So this is how I get ages on these rocks. And then the same process is also how that magnet can also be reset to look for other elements and isotopes. And that's that other chemistry component that tells us something about how the rocks formed and not just when they formed. And so we're going to take a brief diversion because I keep saying magma and all of this stuff, but this is all related to something called plate tectonics, which for geology and earth science, this is sort of our unifying theory that ties everything we know about the planet together. And so magmatism, all those rocks I study, they're determined by plate tectonics. So our surface of the earth is made up of these things called plates. They're basically just solid rock that sort of sit over this or float over this molten, sort of weak, partially molten, it's called the mantle. It's what's below Earth's surface. And on that crust is what sits all of the land and water that we interact with as humans. So if you can go outside and pick up some dirt, you're looking at part of Earth's crust, which is the plate. That is shifting around on Earth's surface. And we're going to come back to this when we talk about supercontinents, because these plates have been shifting around through Earth's surface through all of Earth's history, which is really fascinating. And what I love about plate tectonics and this idea that these plates are moving is that probably none of you have been to the Mariana Trench because it's at the bottom of the ocean, but when two plates collide or pull apart or grind past each other, they can form different features of our planet. And so basically everything on Earth's surface can be explained through plate tectonics. And so I like to use this comparison of the Mariana Trench because this is the deepest depth of Earth's surface. And this is formed because two plates are colliding together and one is getting pushed underneath. And where that's being pushed underneath, it creates this sort of valley, which is what is that deep Mariana Trench. And we're going to come back to this because this whole process of one plate going under the other is called subduction. But I won't spoil that surprise yet. And another feature that that same motion of two plates colliding can cause is a mountain building event. So instead of one plate going under, those two plates can collide and then get really thick. And this is like the Himalayan mountains where we have Mount Everest. That's Earth's highest feature. And so I really love this comparison of plate motion has produced Earth's deepest point and Earth's highest point. It's what helps form rivers. It's why we have different climate in different places. Plate tectonics is such a phenomenal theory that is relatively new. It was really only broadly accepted in like the 1960s, 1970s. So it's really something we take for granted today, but this is something that is really, really important, and we're only still learning how it works. And so just to like go from a simple topic to way more complicated, what is important about plate tectonics is that where these plates are pulling apart and colliding together and grinding past, that's where all of that magma is being formed. And so there's lots of ways to form magma. The most common way most people probably think is to heat up the rock, but also you can add fluids to the rock. This is sort of like we call these volatiles or adding water because it's sort of like when you add salt to a pot of water to boil for pasta, that salt helps that water boil earlier. When you add fluids to rock, it's sort of the opposite effect. That fluid helps that rock melt faster. And then you can also decrease the pressure of a rock, and that can help it melt. So if you think about, I said the plates are rigid rock sitting on slightly molten rock. The reason the rocks below the plates are slightly molten is that it's under so much temperature and pressure that those rocks, they're not quite stable anymore. They kind of have like silly putty. You can sort of smear them around. And if you take that really hot rock at depth and bring it to the surface, suddenly has space to spread out. And so it's going to melt like magma. And so most of the rocks that I look at are these ones in blue, this addition of fluid. And the reason I focus on that is, again, this is that idea of subduction zones. When those two plates collide, the one that goes down, it starts to melt. And when it melts, it starts coming back up through the overlying crust, and it creates new crust, and it creates magma. And so we call this subduction zone. So that's just when those two plates collide, and that lower crust gets shoved underneath and returned back into the mantle where it's melted, and theoretically it comes back up in the magma at a future time. And what's important about these subduction zones are that these are forming at the edges of continents. And so you can see in this big picture, the blue dots are earthquakes, but we don't need to pay attention to those. The red triangles are all the magnetism around the planet, and all of it can be explained by plate tectonics. But these green lines that I've added to this picture are where we have subduction zones. And so what you can see is that in almost all major mountain zones around our planet, those are happening at these subduction zones. And what's if we kind of think back to that system of Earth and its different layers, and that this inner mantle molten layer is sort of flowing, allowing those surface crusts to move around, what we get is this big diagram in the bottom where as that colliding crust goes underneath and that magma, it starts to melt and that magma starts coming up to the surface. This concept of magmatism, we call this arc, just meaning it's like along the continent edge. This is where new crust is formed. And this is a really important theory to geology because everything we know about the continents and their formation are based on this magmatism happening and these plate motions happening.
Yeah, and we have a number of questions for you.
Great.
First being, how far back can we theoretically date rock? So is it longer than the planet has been a planet?
Oh, that's a great question. If we could find the materials, we could date rocks, ooh, I think about 14 billion years old, which is about the age of our, I have to get this, I always get this wrong. It's about the age of our solar system, is about 14 billion years old, which we know based on dating meteors that have hit Earth and looking at the isotopes in those rocks. So yeah, great question.
And which elements give us the longest dating ability?
Uranium and lead. Well, actually, that's a tricky question. So uranium and lead do, but actually, some of the oldest knowledge we know about Earth are from really short decay systems because we know that the initial unstable atom would only have lasted about a few millions of years. And so the presence of the secondary atom in relationship to some things that we did with uranium and lead tells us sort of a secondary system of how Earth formed. That's sort of how we know that the moon was sort of hit off of Earth because the Earth and moon have really similar isotopes. Yeah, so great question. It's kind of a two-way factor there.
And one of my questions that you actually answered was if a rock's crystal structure can change during that subduction or that collision of plates, how fast will the structure of that crystal change? Is it because when I think of rocks changing, it's over that like, you know, geologic timescale that we always talk about, like super long. Can it happen quickly?
Yeah, most subduction zone systems we think of happening on tens of thousands to maybe a million years, so relatively slow for humans. But for geology, that can be relatively fast. There are these features called super or large igneous provinces. We call these LIPs. And these are times in Earth's history when probably the crust was separating, and it separated so fast that it allowed so much molten material to come to the surface all at one point that we're able to see layers in really fast resolutions of like 1,000 years. And the quantities are so big it could be the same volume as like Rhode Island of material and bigger, but that would be coming out like all at once in really brief periods of time. So yeah, it can be, usually it's pretty slow geologically, but sometimes people think of this as like catastrophic events, but really it's just occasionally there's really fast events like a super volcano could happen, and which would affect a lot of things all at once. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is kind of a silly one, but how do you do science on magma? Are you able to like take magma to a lab, or is it always going to be a lava rock or something?
That's a great question. There are people out there who do take magma samples. Well, they take lava samples. They take at the surface of Earth because it's cooled enough that they can find things resistant to those temperatures. But I actually only ever work with the solid rock form because I want to see those crystals. That's if I just have magma, I can't really date anything out of it because it's just a giant homogeneous body of molten material. So I need to have that solid structure so I know that this crystal formed at this precise date. And that's, yeah.
And then one more we have, in addition to dating rocks, how hard is it to determine where they might have originally been formed if they've been moved? I'm thinking of Stonehenge, for instance.
Oh, great question. So not all rocks are datable. And I know that Stonehenge has had a lot of study on it for where it might be from and how old it might be. And one tricky thing about rocks is that, again, I said I do radioactive decay, but other ways that we date rocks, which are really fascinating, are there's a method of dating a rock based on how long it's been exposed to the sun. And so I know for Stonehenge, some scientists have looked at when those rocks must have been like chipped away and those faces first exposed to the sun. And then in terms of the chemistry and knowing where a rock is from, that can be really complicated, which is crazy to say, actually, even like as I know it's true, because rocks are so unique and the chemistry is so specific. It's like a thumbprint. But just like thumbprints, it's not 100% unique. There is a statistical chance that you'll have the same thumbprint as someone else. And rocks are the same way. Even though we can break down those isotopes and look at that whole chemical suite of what makes it up, it's hard to know exactly where that came from because the processes that form those rocks are the same. And so it's not like every volcanic rock looks like every other volcanic rock. But if you're on the same magmatic arc, like I was saying, along those continent edges, sometimes it can be really hard to know if it's from point A or like 1,000 miles away at point B, because they're forming in the same rocks, the same way, maybe the same time. And so it's not as easy as it sounds like it should be. It's surprisingly challenging to say definitively that this is where something is from. Awesome. All right. So now we've taken geochronology, we've thrown in that magmatic component, and now we're going to talk about these supercontinents. So I've been slowly building up to this, and this is a little video I want to show really quick. And it has music, but hopefully it doesn't. I tried to take the sound off. It doesn't really matter, but I'm going to talk over it. So if the music's playing, I'll try to talk loudly. This isn't all of Earth history. It's just the past 500 million years. But basically, what I love about this diagram through Esri is that they show you both what the continents are doing through time, and then they wrap it back around the globe, and so you can see on the globe what we think that is doing. And this concept of plates moving through time is really important because if and actually goes back to that last question, because the older the material, the harder it is to know what that continent would have looked like when that formed. And this is one of the reasons why Antarctica is so special, which we'll get into, but most of the continents have changed a lot through time. And so I'll just play this video and you can take a look for yourself. Oops. Let's see if that works. There we go. So what you can see is about 550 million years ago, the bottom of the page is south, top of the page is north, and then right in the center would be the equator. There's some things are labeled, which is kind of a rough labeling, but what you see is that crust was all at the South Pole area, it slowly shifted up, and it's slowly now getting more and more like what we think of the planet today. And we're at 50 million years ago. It's broadly about what it looks like today. And that's this is a really fast compilation, but this is important because this is only 500 million years and Earth is 4.5 billion years old. So there's 4 other sets of time where these continents have been moving. And so that idea that we could just take something and know where it came from gets more complicated because some of these land masses used to be connected. And so you might find something in North America that you also find in another continent. And so some of you might have seen this, especially if you've looked at a world map. You can see that South America and Africa seem like they fit really nicely into each other, like little puzzle pieces. And that's true. They were once connected, and most of the continents were connected. And I'm going to, see if I can just get to the next page. And if we think about those land masses moving through time, we call these supercontinents, which are basically just when those land masses are all connected together, making up a giant landmass, which is why it's called a supercontinent. But what's fascinating about supercontinents is that they change through time. And so again, I just showed you only like the past 500 million years of continent movement, but there are lots of really fascinating videos out there of what we think all of Earth history looked like, starting from when it was a molten planetesimal body to modern day. and lots of complicated in between things. We've thought like Earth has been fully frozen before. Uh, the continents were once like all on the South Pole, all on the equator, all at the North Pole. I mean, they move all over the place. And we know that through a variety of methods. But what's important about this is that again, it's reflecting back to that plate tectonics. When if we start at 500 million years ago, we basically had two supercontinents. One was Laurasia, which is North America, Europe, and Asia today. And the other supercontinent was Gondwana. And I'm going to just cheat here and tell you with the labels, Gondwana is where Antarctica is at that back at 500 million years ago. And so Gondwana is what I study, and it's not just because it's the best supercontinent. It's actually because it's the most well-known of all the supercontinents that we've had. And so if we go forward in time, we can see that those two separate supercontinents actually collided together and made Pangea when we had just one giant supercontinent. When those continents collide and make fewer and larger continents, but then through time, we also have had them separate back apart. So when those continents rip apart, they create more and smaller continents. And so it's this kind of like a gamble almost when as we get older in time to actually know what those continents were doing. And so really about 500 million years old is as far back as we can go with any strong certainty and say, yes, we know these continents were in these locations. And part of that is because that's what crust is still around today to date. And but there are some parts of crusts that are super old that allow us to go further back in time. So if we start with Gondwana now on the left, we can go further back and we know that there's some supercontinents called Rodinia and a supercontinent called Columbia or Nuna, depending on which time frame you put it into. But you can see that these shapes, even though they're labeled, get less and less believable because they're harder and harder to pinpoint. We might be able to take one rock from Antarctica, but we don't necessarily know if that means all of Antarctica was in that supercontinent the further back in time we go. And so this is where Antarctica actually gets really fascinating because I think, because Antarctica is this giant, it's pretty large continent that pretty much has been isolated now for a really long time, but it's been relatively stable also. It hasn't broken up and been pushed back together like a lot of our other continents have. And so we'll get into that, but I'll take some quick questions on the supercontinents if there was any in there. I know I sort of breezed through that section.
Yeah, we have just a few. So this is a really good one that I saved for this part of the talk.
Oh,
so
sorry, just a second.
Oh,
sorry, I had my sound off.
can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Sorry.
All right. So we have one that says, we know that Earth's land masses have moved around a lot and formed different shapes through time. How does that affect global climate?
That's a great question. That actually is, I said that we thought at one point Earth was fully frozen over. Based on a lot of different features, which I won't go into, but water has the ability to regulate heat way better than land does. So when you heat up water, it stays that temperature for a lot longer, whereas land will heat up fast and get really, really hot, but then it'll cool down fast and get really, really cold. And so today, our continents are mostly in the northern hemisphere. And so in the northern hemisphere, we get a lot of winter to summer transitions. So the Arctic freezes over, and then in summer, the Arctic starts melting. And we're seeing that more and more with climate change, that the Arctic is getting more and more melted. But if you looked at Antarctica, it's completely surrounded by ocean. And so that temperature doesn't heat up as much and doesn't cool down as much. And so for other reasons, Antarctica is cold, but it also just stays cold because it's isolated from land masses that would heat up and cool down in those bigger cycles. And so where those continents are has a huge effect on our climate because it dictates that that circulation of heat in our atmosphere, and to some degree the circulation of heat in our oceans, because that ocean water has to sort of flow around the continents. So um, Antarctica being fully isolated from other continents actually allows ocean circuit to flow all the way around it, which sort of literally traps warm water away from the continent. But also that circling motion affects the air above it, which traps cold air around Antarctica and pushes out hot air away from the continent. So yeah, the climate is hugely affected by our changing continents.
Yeah, and so another question that you kind of touched on a little was how much time is occurring between the movement of the continents, and if there's any consistency in that. Using what we have for knowledge of the past, is there any way to kind of predict the movements of them in the future, or is it subject to change based on the environment or other things?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of theories out there for what our continents will do in the future. I think the same ESRI, or Science Research Institute, Esri has another compilation on YouTube where they actually go into the future, which is really fascinating. And they base that on the plates, the plate boundaries. So we know the type of plate boundaries. Is it pulling apart? Is it colliding together? Is it grinding past? And based on that, we can kind of roughly know if a continent is pulling apart and the motion is steady, it's probably not suddenly going to just turn around and start smashing back together. We would see a slow winding down and then winding back up. And so, yes, we have a great idea of how continents are actively moving. For example, I'm in Santa Barbara, California, and technically, even though I'm in North America, I am on a little sliver of crust that's on the Pacific Ocean plate. And Santa Barbara and this little edge of Southern California is slowly moving up to the northwest, away from North America, heading off to be its own little island. um, and so we can predict these things, and actually the motion is relatively predictable as well. Today, most plates are moving about 2 to 10 centimeters per, 2 to 10 millimeters per year, which sounds really, really slow, but actually it's, geologically speaking, 10 is the sort of faster end. And what we know through time is that those rates may have been faster and slower. So I said those large igneous provinces, when the crust pulls apart and then huge amounts of magma come out, we think those are probably times when it was really, really fast. And so when things move slow, it gives the crust time to cool and level out. But when things move really fast, suddenly just like tons of material is like, oh, let's shoot to the surface and melt everything. And so um, there's a variety of ways we just think we know what the rate of those are based on ocean data, actually. But it's only predictable, I think, about 200 million years. So we don't know all of Earth history what those rates would be, but at least for the last 200 million years, we feel fairly confident that we know that they've been pretty stable.
And would you ever, that you just made me think of this now, would you ever decide where to live based on your geologic understanding? And should people and like insurance companies be concerned with how our plates are moving?
That's really, yeah, I mean, as a geologist, what's funny, I went to undergrad in Iowa, actually, which is very prone to flooding. And one of my geology professors had a property that he lived on that he specifically bought because it was the right elevation to river distance, so that the flood plan, based on geology research, not necessarily insurance research, predicted that it was almost impossible to ever have a flood happen. And I think it is important because in Santa Barbara, also here, we have a lot of forest fires, and we're right on the San Andreas Fault, so we have earthquake hazards, and then we also have landslide hazards right here in Santa Barbara because of the rocks that are in the hills over the city. And so it is important to think about those natural factors when you're living somewhere, because if you're in a place that's going to be flooded all the time, you're probably going to have to rebuild your home a lot. And that's not a very good situation for anybody. So yeah, I personally think it's insurance companies should do a lot more to help people relocate out of areas that are highly prone to hazards. Awesome. So jumping back in, that evolution of those supercontinents, I already gave it away, but Antarctica was part of Gondwana. And before each of these continents split off and sort of headed to where they live today, when they were all combined, there we go. When they were all combined, each of these boundaries between the continents gives us a little picture of what Gondwana was like when it smashed together and what was going on. And so even though today Antarctica is sitting on the South Pole, completely isolated, I've already said that, there's no landmass really around it. Here's a great picture. Antarctica is just this giant ice-covered continent, and then South America sort of peeks in a little bit here, Australia over here. These fully divided away probably no more recent than 30 million years ago. So Antarctica's been isolated for a long time, which has allowed it to be as cold as it is. But what's even more fascinating about Antarctica is that we think when we think about Antarctica, we call it into two ways. It's hard to see on this, but right here down the center is something called the Transantarctic Mountains. So one of the only parts of Antarctica that's actually rock that is exposed. Everything to the right, we call that East Antarctica, and everything to the left, we call West Antarctica. And West Antarctica is made up of a lot of little crust pieces that have been smashing together and then smashed into East Antarctica. But we think broadly that East Antarctica has been stable for a really long time. And so Antarctica is a pretty unique continent. I already said it's pretty large, but you can see on this bottom right, it's about 1.5 times the size of the contiguous United States. And it's almost 99% covered in ice and snow. So there's not a lot of rock there to do geology, but the rocks that are there are really well exposed because Antarctica is really dry or really high. It's also really dry, and that makes the rock exposure really great because those rocks aren't getting weathered as much as they would in other places. So when I went to Antarctica, I actually was able to see hammer marks from the last team who had been to the same mountain range literally 12 years before. So the weathering is so minimal, you have incredible exposure. But with that also comes some of the coldest and windiest conditions on our planet, but it's still a really fascinating place. And I guess I shoved the rest of Antarctica into my research section, but Antarctica is really fascinating because I like this comparison actually of it being about the size of the United States, because on this picture, the Transantarctic Mountains run right through the center, which is approximately the United States continental divide, which Abby was telling me about the Appalachian Trail, which is really close to Asheville, but the continental divide is probably the North America's largest continuous mountain range. And it's a great analogy to the Transantarctic Mountains because when I go do my research, I take all of my rocks from the Transantarctic Mountains. And that would be almost like going to the Rocky Mountains and taking a bunch of rocks and then trying to unravel what the history of the entire United States was. That's basically how geology works in Antarctica. We can go to the edges of the continent and we could go to these mountains, and otherwise most of the continent is a total mystery to us, which makes the geology there still really exciting because we can't just go there and look at it. We have to use these chemistry methods to unravel what's literally hidden below the ice. So before I jump into my research, I'll take any more questions.
So yeah, I have a couple, but I can save them for the end. I do want to be conscious of your time. I can talk to you forever. It is almost 1, so please feel free to continue as long as you can.
Great. Okay, so um, now that I've told you about all the different parts of what I do with my science, or I'm going to tell you what I actually do then in Antarctica. So here's a schematic again of that Gondwana land, and about 500 million years old. And if we looked at Antarctica, suck in right here, what we see along this whole, on here, it's the bottom edge, this green band I've labeled as the subduction zone. This was this giant magmatic arc, which actually today still is active in South America. The South American Andes Mountains are still a subduction zone forming because of that subduction magmatism. But when it was connected with the rest of Gondwana, that magmatism was also happening along Antarctica and Australia. And that rock that was being formed, those molten cooling magma bodies, are what today are exposed in the Transantarctic mountains. And so uh, this green area boxed in red across Antarctica and Australia, that magmatism is what I'm studying, broadly focusing on that 500 million years ago period, again, because these are the best preserved rocks and it's harder to go further back in time. And I said that the rocks are really well exposed where they're exposed. So here's some examples. I spent most of my time in two locations, the Lily Range and the Queen Maud Mountains, which can be seen here on the right and at the top, and then also the Miller Range, which are these two little ones on the bottom left. And these rocks are, they're igneous rocks. They're basically, these were once giant molten bodies. And what I love about them is that this big one that I've blown up on the right, you can see through here, there's these different textures of white rock and then black rock. Those are like if you could mix up a batch of cookies and you could see the chocolate chips or some oats in it. Like this is what geology is like. It's like taking that batter and then suddenly freezing it and then taking a slice through it and being like, all right, now what was in these cookies? These cookies are made up of oats and chocolate chips. And then it's hard to see that you added sugar and butter, but when I take the chemistry, that's how I pull out those other ingredients that made up that magma body. And so these rocks are so beautiful for me as a geologist, but they're amazingly preserved. And it was really incredible to do field work down there, but we were out in the sort of edge of the Antarctic plateau. So here you can see it's mostly, you're just always surrounded by ice, but where we have rocks, we collected a bunch of rocks. And so what I did then, if I could here, you see this little diagram of Antarctica. It's flipped from that other image, but I started, it's kind of confusing to have east on the left and west on the right, but bear with me. It makes sense if you zoom into this little box, and I have here that same magma area, and the colors here represent the types of rocks that those are forming. And broadly, what I study are these purple rocks. These are those magma bodies that have cooled. But what's really neat about the study areas that I've worked in is this red area right here at the Central Transantarctic Mountains, because this is some really old rock that's exposed on in the mountains there that I'm going to talk about here in just a slide or two. But my area is broadly covered northern Victoria Land, the central Transantarctic Mountains. We call this the Miller Range, right where these red rocks are. And then way down at the bottom in the Queen Maud Mountains. And then I didn't study these rocks, but a previous grad student in my lab group has studied a lot of the rocks from southern Victoria Land. And so slowly we're teasing together this continuous picture of what is going to tell us the most about these 500 million year old rocks. And what's awesome about this work is that I said I pull out these zircons. So here is an image of a zircon. And what you see these different colored bands, and that's basically the different types of chemistry showing up in something called a cathode luminescence SEM image. And you don't need to worry about that. It's just that when there's a lot of uranium, it sort of sparks up brighter. And so these lighter layers are where there's a lot of uranium, and then the darker layers are where there's not quite as much uranium, but all of it's still datable. And if you imagine a zircon starting from some tiny little fragment, slowly like an egg a little bit, each layer that grows on that zircon is when it gets younger and younger to the outside. And so when I take a zircon, I do a special method called depth profiling, where I start at the surface and I drill down into that zircon, and I'm able to date each of these individual layers. And what we're finding in these rocks is that the outer edges are those 500 million year old rocks I was telling you about. But as we get into the center of these tiny little zircons, you can see the scale is 50 microns. They're barely visible with the naked eye. The centers get really, really old. We're looking at 3 billion year old centers to these rocks or these crystals. And so this is really important. And across my field work, I've collected over 3,000 pounds of rocks that has turned into about 500 rocks that we'll be using, which is about 10,000 zircons, just like this image that I've pulled out of the rock and analyzed, which has produced about 500,000 zircon data points. And that doesn't even count the chemistry analyses that I do on the actual rock itself. And so I've spent so much time in labs and staring at computers that the fieldwork, though amazing, is a small component of how much time I spend indoors doing chemistry.
That explains the 6th year.
Yes. So I do a lot of big data research, and what that's produced is a table just like this. This is sort of the simplest way I knew how to present my data, is that if you go back through time, you can ignore the left axis. It's just telling you numbers for this chart. What I see across all of my rocks is that these rocks in Antarctica are showing us 5 distinct magmatic events through time, starting at about 3.1 billion years ago and ending at about 527 million years ago. So what's also great is that these also broadly overlap with those supercontinent systems. And so if we go back to those rocks, now I've labeled some of them so they mean a little bit more to you. When I say gneiss, those are sort of really old rocks, and all of these mafic or granitic dikes are this younger magmatism that's literally cutting through those older rocks. And so what we're seeing is a repeated system of this magma being shot through these older rocks, which is why those crystals are showing old centers and young edges. Instead of melting that crystal, it's actually just growing more crystal on the outside of it, which is another reason why zircon is such a powerful geochronology tool. It doesn't tend to melt completely, it just like keeps growing. And so a quick brief diversion so that the next couple things make sense. You can ignore 99% of this. Really what I want you to pay attention to is that in this left diagram, if Earth started about 4.5 billion years ago, there's a certain amount of another isotope system, lutetium and hafnium. And hafnium is a really powerful isotope because it tells us something about how old the original rock was when it first formed. And so through time, this hafnium concentration is going to get bigger and bigger to the present. That's on the left here, because as the initial unstable lutetium isotope decays, we build up more and more hafnium. So relatively straightforward so far. But what's great about hafnium is that when a magma forms, you can see this little arrow here, what happens is that magma is going to pull a little bit of material off of that rock. And so the rock that gets left behind in Earth's depth, we call this the depleted mantle, that's going to follow a slightly higher trajectory because all of that material, we've pulled it out. And so the mantle looks relatively high in this hafnium concentration, and that melt pulled off is going to just now start forming that hafnium concentration, and so it looks lower. And so if we started from Earth's original place, it would just make this straight line. But every time we pull melt off of it, the two components left behind are going to deviate in what their concentration is. And so on the right, this Lu lutetium to HF hafnium schematic, if we make that into a simpler space, so instead of everything sort of slanting up, we change that to it's a flat axis. What we start to see is that the Earth's interior is what angles up, and then anything that deviates off of that going down is showing us when material was melted out of Earth's interior. And so I know that's a lot to take in one slide, but hopefully it'll make sense for this next image. Basically what we're seeing is that on the left, these are that hafnium values. That 0 is that baseline of if we just looked at Earth's depth back when Earth formed, and that line going up, I've labeled it depleted mantle. That's if we're forming rocks being formed from the mantle at any given time. So that's that new magma coming up in these volcanic arcs. And this dashed line that's going down, that's showing us that if material came out of the Earth at a certain time, how that hafnium value is going to change because it's continuing to build up, but there's no new lutetium. And so what we start to get from a chart like this is that each of these blue dots represents a global compilation of all the zircon ever analyzed from all scientists around the world. And what most scientists are showing is that all of this blue concentration is sort of really densely in what I've labeled juvenile addition. This is new magma coming from the mantle, but that there is a lot of data down here in this lower area along that dashed line that I've called crustal recycling. And that just means we've taken really old crust, we've remelted it and shoved it back up into Earth's surface. And this blue line at the bottom is showing you the total amount of zircon. And then these orange bars are showing you those supercontinents. And so what you can see is that not always, but a lot of these peaks in zircon data are when we have these supercontinent events, because when those continents collide, that's when those subduction zones happen. That's when that magma is happening. And the idea that most scientists support is that these subduction zones are where new crust forms. We're pulling stuff out of the mantle and putting it into our continental crust. And that's broadly, as you can see from this global compilation, that must be supported because we're seeing such heavy concentration of this new material. But what's confusing about that is that if we could look at a chart of theories for how our continental crust has grown through time, the oldest stuff being on the right, you can see the molten earth body, and then the present being on the left, you can see our present day earth body. A lot of theories suggest that each of these lines represents how much crust from 0 to 100 has formed through Earth history. And what you should all see is that broadly, every theory agrees that today we've maxed out on what our new crust is. And so it's confusing to think that through time, we're continuing to build new crust, and yet we haven't had new crust through time, according to some theories, or a lot of theories say we just keep adding more. And so the debate here is, will Earth continue to build more crust and completely be covered in just crust and have no more ocean? Or like this top theory, have we sort of peaked in time and then now we're just staying steady on the amount of continental crust we have? And so this is where my research comes in. This global chart is each of these purple regions shows you the oldest crust on our planet. And what you see down in Antarctica is that there's a little bit of this crust exposed. And I've gone to that area. That's that red rock from that map I showed you in Antarctica. And from this, I'm able to make that same chart with my data that shows that I am seeing new material come out of Earth's mantle, but Antarctica, where we haven't had this complicated history of younger tectonics imprinting over that older record, I'm mostly seeing that it's just old crust being remelted through time. It's following these dashed lines, meaning that that global compilation that's showing that we're getting all new crust that might not be reflective of actually how our tectonics works. That very possibly what we're actually seeing is mostly old crust that's getting continuously remelted, like those field photos I showed you where we had that old crust and then that young magma is cutting through it, which is mixing it all up, and it's making that signature look young, look like it's new material from the mantle, but actually we probably have maxed out on the amount of continental crust we'll have, and Earth will stay mostly 3/4 just an ocean body, which is really fascinating to think about. And also fascinating as we think about going forward, because as our continents keep juggling around the surface, um, it changes what we think about Earth's evolution to know that the continent pieces will probably just stay the same total surface area. It's just how they're situated that's going to change. And so now we can start doing better predictions for volcanics and climate and all sorts of really fascinating things. And that's basically the end of, of everything. I know I shoved a lot in at the end with my research, but hopefully it didn't get too complicated.
No, I thought it came together very well. I didn't understand it until you were like, hopefully this is the one. And I was like, yes, that's the one. So that's very, very crazy. And I do have a couple of questions for you. So first of all, what do you think? Is Antarctica your favorite geological I guess formation on Earth, or do you have one that you wish you could see?
Oh, wow. That's a really hard question. It's serendipitous you asked because I actually have this map that I've made and I update it all the time for where geology is taking me in the world. And I'm so far very heavy on the Americas and Europe and Antarctica, but I'm slowly getting my um, touring into Africa and the Middle East, and I'm hoping to start seeing more places in Asia. And geology is so diverse, and I don't think I've ever seen something in geology where I said, that's it, I never need to see another fascinating thing of geology again, because every time I see something new, I find something new and amazing that interests me and really fascinates me. Earth has a really fascinating, I mean, the way our planet formed and evolved is really just striking to me, and I don't think I'll ever have one place that'll be the most impressive. It's just everything is more and more impressive.
And what do you think would be the implication of if we were creating more crust, or if we, were losing some of that ocean cover? Would that be really bad? Because thinking about how temperatures, like you mentioned, the fluctuation between temperatures changing in water versus on land, what do you think would be the kind of like effect of all that?
Yeah, so actually this goes back to one of the earliest questions that I answered about our formation compared to the other planets. Also in our habitability zone around the sun is Mars and Venus, and they're really great examples of directions Earth could have gone if it had formed slightly differently. So if Earth continues to build more crust, it could become a Mars-like planet where it's just all rock, no water, and no more tectonics. Because if we don't have, I didn't go into this, but that balance of ocean and continent, it's actually ocean crust under the ocean. And when ocean crust meets continent crust, it's kind of like really thin crust hitting really thick crust. And that thin crust is always what subducts. And so that's actually why the continents can move. And so if we run out of ocean crust, the continents will basically stop moving, and we'll have a solid surface like Mars that doesn't do anything anymore, which would upset our ability to um, have water actually. And then the other way we could have gone is the Venus route, where it's actually really hot and it's just like this gaseous water body, where if we're destroying all of our crust, we have no more land left. And so those are kind of the two extreme ends that we could be taking with Earth, depending on how it's evolving through time.
That's really interesting that the ocean will always subduct. And I mean, that makes so much sense because you've never seen like, the corner of Canada or something, just like, the ocean just come over it. So yeah, that's kind of crazy. And then we'll end with like kind of a more fun question. When you move, do you move around? Do you literally move boxes of rocks?
I do. My parents very fortunately are generously housing many boxes of rocks that I own that I've collected from my travels, and thankfully zircon are very tiny. So my actual research here uses E, even though I've collected thousands of pounds of rocks. All rocks from Antarctica eventually go to Ohio State University, where they're stored in the Polar Rock Repository. And so all I get to keep are these tiny little mounts that are about the size of a quarter. And I have, I think, 30 of them. And each of those mounts has about 10 samples worth of zircon on them. So zircon are luckily very tiny, and I can store a lot of them on a mount.
Very good. All right, Elizabeth. Well, thank you so much for spending what is your morning with us, our
Yes.
afternoon. We really appreciate it. And I do have about 2 or 3 more questions that I'm just going to cut us off here, but I'll go ahead and email them to you so I can get some answers for you.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, and thank you everyone who is watching and who is participating and sending in questions. We will be back next week. Thanks again, Elizabeth.
Thanks,
Good
Abby.
luck.
Bye, everyone.